battle, and rise, right? And have serious conversation about things that matter. And the storyteller that, over a Skype date, I was in New York, she was in Seattle, and I was interviewing for my role here. And through, the introduction of Sharon Maeda, when I decided to join this organization, I met someone who was warm, I met someone who cared about justice, and also loved stories. Not just stories in the sense of, sometimes people say, why do stories matter? Not stories in terms of fairy tales, but stories of what we might create, right? And I think that's what makes this person very powerful. And so I'll briefly read their bio, and then we'll go from there. Congresswoman Pramila Jayapal is a bold progressive fighter for justice. After 9/11, she founded the group Hate Free Zone to counter the rise of Islamophobia and hate crimes. Now One America, the largest immigrant rights organization in Washington state. At One America, she successfully sued the Bush administration to stop the deportation of thousands of Somali immigrants and led the largest voter registration drive in state history. She was first elected to the Washington State Senate in 2014, where she fought for gender pay equity and secured over $5 million in pre-apprenticeship programs for women and people of color. Today, she is the first Indian American woman in Congress, as well as the first woman of color in the Washington congressional delegation. She's a proud immigrant to the United States who came here from India by herself at the age of 16. She believes in working in movements on the ground to win progressive victories, and she believes in an intersectional approach to combating racism, environmental injustice, LGBTQ injustice, and economic unfairness. Please welcome Congresswoman Pramila Jayapal.
The best Skype date I've ever had. And it turned into a long-lasting relationship. And my husband approves completely. I can't say enough about Mozart and his leadership and how incredibly impressed we were when we got the chance to interview him over Skype. And we literally all got off the phone and were like, oh my God, we have to have this person here helping us to build the leadership ladder and really thinking about intersectional politics. So Mozart, I said this earlier, I'll say it again so everyone can hear, I never do events at 7:30 in the morning, the day after I fly in from DC, never, only for you. And of course the other person I'm doing it for is Sharon Maeda, who helped to start 21 Progress and just has been such a champion and such an incredible leader, leader developing other leaders is what I love about Sharon. Everyone calls her Auntie Sharon because she babysat. You can say anything to Sharon about anybody, and she'll say, oh, I babysat their kids. Oh, that person was an intern for me. So Sharon, thank you for everything that you do. It's really wonderful to be here, and I know you're talking about storytelling, and to me this is really one of the most important ways that we make change happen. And I'll tell you my personal story and tie it to the work that I'm doing. So as Mozart said, I'm an immigrant. I was born in India, came here when I was 16 years old. And that experience of being here by myself, knowing that as many immigrants know, that their parents have sacrificed everything to allow them to come here and given up so much, because my parents, when they sent me here, I think they knew that I was never going to be going back. And it took me 17 years to get my citizenship, which is really nothing compared to the people who come here and are doing work but simply don't even have a path, no matter how long it is. And all of that, I think, has informed who I am and what I work on today, and the focus on immigrant rights, civil rights, human rights. But I don't think I totally understood how my personal story would affect my life choices. I always knew that it meant that I was going to work for Opportunity for All, but probably wasn't until 9/11. I had worked on international global health before that, but it wasn't until 9/11 when the hate crimes started happening against Arabs, Muslims, and South Asians at the time. And I remember watching TV the morning of the September 11th attacks. I had just moved into a new house, and everything was in boxes. And at that time, believe it or not, I had one TV, and it was about this big. And my friend from the East Coast called me at 5 in the morning or whatever it was and said, "Are you watching TV? Have you seen what's happened?" And I pulled out my little TV from a box, and I plugged it in, and I watched, and I very consciously thought to myself, everything is going to change for people who look like me. Mm-hmm. And is this very defining moment that came to be defined as an us versus them moment by George Bush and John Ashcroft and many others. And I think it was the beginning of, in many ways, it was the beginning of my political consciousness around what we had to fight for in this country to allow for everyone to have opportunities. And so today, when I am on the Judiciary Committee, why does that matter? Because I sit on the Judiciary Committee now. And we handle, I'm on the Immigration Subcommittee. We are dealing with all of the issues that this president, this administration is trying to use to divide us and to somehow brand brown and black people as criminals or immigrants as, as lawbreakers, all of those things that are so not part of who we are as a country and not part of my own story of coming to this country as an immigrant. And being given opportunity, and yet seeing all around me people who are not getting that kind of opportunity. And so these contradictions between our personal stories and experiences and the broader political story that's being told, I think are part of what drive me in really fighting for immigrant justice today. And and I think that I always say that any victory that we have won, and I'm so proud to have founded One America when it was called Hate Free Zone, and have led it for 11 and a half years, worked alongside Dreamers, worked to get DACA. I mean, DACA came about because we couldn't get the DREAM Act passed. That's the truth. And the DREAM Act came so close, passed the House and then failed the Senate, and I still remember that day, and we had a meeting of all of the DACA folks to watch what was happening in the Senate. But the stories of individual DACA recipients, well, not DACA recipients back then, undocumented dreamers, that is the only reason we got DACA. The only reason we got DACA is because dreamers were able to tell their stories and put a human face on the suffering. And what happens in policy so much is that the human face gets lost. And even when you think about numbers, people talk about numbers and income inequality and wealth inequality. What happens is it doesn't resonate for people because they can't attach it to a face. And so numbers are just a collection of stories. Statistics are just a collection of stories of people, and we lose those stories. And so that, to me, is why storytelling becomes so important. It was part of everything we did. It's the only reason we got DACA. It's the only reason that we won the healthcare fight 3 times, was because people came out and told their stories. And elders, seniors in wheelchairs came and sat in people's offices and had the Capitol Police take them out of those offices. And so people had to ask themselves, is this how I want to treat my mother? Is this how I would treat my child? Is this how I'm going to treat, my son or daughter? And so, the storytelling aspect of our work, I think, is probably the hardest in some ways, because everyone wants to be objective. Right? People say, well, this is an objective study. Let's take the emotion out of it. I actually think what we have to do is put the emotion back into policymaking. That part of what we've lost is the ability to see and act with compassion as if people were our people. And I've always lived my life by this idea that we're all better off when we're all better off. Storytelling helps to make that real, so that it's not just somebody over there who is doing X, Y, and Z, but it's my child, my mother, my sister, my grandmother. And so I kind of wanted to keep my part of this short, because I think the benefit of these dialogues is actually for you to talk and for us to have a conversation. But that's why storytelling is so important. I'll end with just saying that I didn't tell my story for a very long time. Like, it was not the story that I would focus on, because I was leading an immigrant rights organization. And I always felt sort of guilty that, as hard as my story was, it really was nothing compared to the resilience and courage of the stories that I was hearing and working with every single day. And so I didn't want the focus to be on me as the leader of an organizing effort. I wanted it to be on other people and other leadership voices. And it wasn't until I ran for office that I realized that I had to do that. I had to tell my story. I wasn't afraid to tell it necessarily, but I realized that it was important for people to understand who I was and what I was going to stand for, and that is a lot of what you elect in an elected official, is you elect a person and a set of values and a set of convictions and a set of moral grounding. And that if I didn't tell my story, I wouldn't be able to get that across. And so now I tell it all the time, and partly I tell it because I want other women of color out there to look at me and say, hey, that's something I could do. And I understand there's 11 Indian American women in the state now running for office. And the Crosscut called me and said, you know, this is amazing. They all say they've been inspired by you. And what I say to people is, look, it's not me. It could be anybody who's in this position. It is the idea that what's possible, you see what's possible in the story of someone else. And so across the country, you know, I get all these emails and letters from young people and people of color and organizers and Indian Americans and immigrants who say, my life has changed because I have a different idea of what's possible. And I really do believe that comes through story, because story makes it real that something different is possible. So let me just stop there, and let's just open it up and take questions and comments or whatever you want to talk about.
And so we're actually going to curate it.
Oh, sorry.
So, I guess you're being open. And so I want to introduce, and before I do, I want to introduce folks to Stephanie Locke. Stephanie is the curator of RISE, and we actually conceptualized RISE 3 weeks ago. It's done. And so I think that shows you, you know, our commitment to getting things done. And then our whole team is here, and so Marissa, Laura, Wendy, Luz, and Susie, you know, we all transformed our entire office to welcome folks, and Stephanie has prepared a number of questions for Pramila, and also we've taken questions from the audience in advance, so that way you folks can, you know, hear really, you know, questions that we've crafted to make best use of your time. So awesome. Thank you, everyone. And thank you, Stephanie.
Good morning, everyone. Really appreciate you all coming out to the launch of this new event series. It's exciting to see a lot of familiar faces, but also a lot of new faces, as we really want this to be a space, you know, that brings people together and into the same room. Congresswoman Jayapal, thank you so much. I know it's 7:30 on a Friday morning, which we were so grateful for, but taking time to be here with us and to share your story and our stories. And as we move into this Q&A part of the event, our goal is to really make sure that everyone leaves with something, whether that's hearing something new or a piece of a story or a fact, finding inspiration, connecting over lived experiences, or just having a morning that you wake up and the first thing that you are a part of is not more bad news, right? So with that, we have a few questions that we want to really start off with that have been sent to us from our audience, from our community, really. So we'll go from there. Can you share a story that has shaped you as a person and one that's like been most meaningful to you throughout your journey so far?
It's hard for me to think of one, but you know, I mean, I shared my immigrant story. Let me give another one that I know you had hoped I would talk about maybe in the beginning. So let me talk about it now. I was out door knocking. So this is a story about how we're really not that different from each other, and that honesty can do a lot to bridge any differences that emerge. So I was out door knocking. Can you all see me in the back? I feel bad because I can. Should I stand up, or are you good? Okay. I don't know if they can see us. I might fall asleep if I sit down. I'm just gonna stand up. You feeling guilty yet, Mozart? Just teasing. So I was out door knocking for my Senate campaign, and I was in sort of the more, you know, in a more rural part of the district, and I went up to this house. It was a beautiful sunny day, and there were two guys out there, big, burly, Caucasian gentlemen, tattoos up and down their arms, and they had their Harleys outside, and they were cleaning their Harleys. And I was like, okay, I wonder how this is gonna go, because we all have stereotypes in our heads about, you know, people, and I try to recognize them and then put them aside. And so I went up to the door and I started talking to them, and we had this amazing conversation about a $15 minimum wage. I was on the committee to pass 15, and a number of other things, and wonderful conversation. We get to towards the end of the conversation. I'm about to make my ask, will you vote for me? And the man says to me, so what do you think about gun control? No, what do you think about guns? Excuse me, he didn't say gun control. He said, what do you think about guns? And I said, well, I don't really like them. I said, but I understand that a lot of responsible people have guns. In fact, my husband used to be a hunter, and when we first got together, we had guns in the house. And I said, but I do believe that people who own guns should be responsible about them, and that they should be willing to lock them up, and we should be willing to have responsible gun restrictions and gun legislation that we're fighting for, and that's what I'm going to work for, because I don't think we have that. I think we have a lobby that's gone astray. And so he looks at me and he's like, oh. He said, I really liked you until this question. So I said, well, let's talk about it. So we talk about it for 5 minutes, 7 minutes. It becomes clear we're not going to resolve this issue. We have different places that we're standing. And so I realized it was time to move on. And I said, well, look, I'd really love your vote. And he said, I was going to vote for you, but I can't because of because of your position on guns. And I said, I understand. And his wife was standing right there. And I said, so let me ask you something. How long have you been married? And he said, 24 years. And I said, and do you and your wife agree on every single issue? And he starts laughing, right? He's like, of course not. And I said, well, you married her. I'm just asking for your vote. And he starts laughing, right? He puts out his hand, takes my hand, and he says, I'm going to vote for you. He said, we don't agree on this issue, and I'm probably going to get mad as hell at you for your vote. But I appreciate that you're honest with me. And too many politicians just don't tell you what they really think, and then they go do something else. They just tell you what you want to hear, and I appreciate that you didn't do that. So that was a good. I know you wanted me to start with that, so I gave you that one.
Thank you. I first heard that story indirectly through Mozart, but when I heard it, it was just so compelling and so much a part of why we want to host this event too. So thank you for that. This next one is submitted from our audience as well, and it's in order to overcome our collective challenges and stand together united, trust and respect must be built and earned respectively. Besides having valuable events such as these, what are other ways we can start to build that trust and earn that respect amongst community groups?
I think the most important thing is to do the work. A lot of people want to run for office now, which is really great. And I do a lot of trainings for people across the country, young people, folks of color who have not really been involved before, and they're like, I want to be in office, what should I do? How should I prepare? And I say, think about what you want to do, not what you want to be. Elected office for me was not what I intended to do. I've never actually planned to be in elected office. Sharon knows this. She's been thinking I'm going to be in elected office, but I didn't really. I thought of myself as an activist, an outside organizer, somebody who was going to push the boundaries on the outside. I've been arrested twice for civil disobedience. I believe in a variety of tactics. And elected office to me was like, that's them and we're here. And that changed, and I can talk about that and why it changed, but I think that the grounding I got working on issues that I cared about, building relationships with people in the context of working for something that we cared about, that was the most important thing that could happen. And so I would just say to people, find the issues that you care about and then work on them and make it a point to go and talk to people in those different groups, and never assume that because somebody seems like they don't agree with you that you're not gonna find something that you can work on together. I think that's also, I'm a strong progressive, as everyone knows, but can I tell another little story?
Yes,
I have another little story that just kind of has been building and building and building, but when I got into Congress, we had a bipartisan trip of all the new members to the Holocaust Museum. And it was talk about storytelling. It was unbelievable, deeply emotional, deeply moving. It was a private tour at night for all of the new Congress members, and so there were Republicans and Democrats. And afterwards, a bunch of us got together around a table to talk about, our experience and what we had heard. And believe it or not, within about 15 minutes, the conversation moved completely to immigration and kind of the connections between the Holocaust and immigration in this country and the anti-immigrant sentiment. And I was so surprised, but all these Republicans started speaking up about how they had taken challenges from the right for their positions on immigration because they thought it was wrong that people had all this anti-immigrant rhetoric. And I'm simplifying a lot. It was not this clear cut. But there were a lot of people who I was surprised to see shared the same views as I did on the value and dignity and respect for immigrants. And so I got together with a guy who is part of the Freedom Caucus. He's from Kansas, and his name is Roger Marshall. He's a physician, and he's a Republican. And we decided to host a small gathering of 12 people, 6 Democrats and 6 Republicans, to talk about immigration and to see if we could find some common ground. And our first meeting, it was his suggestion to do this. We had no staff in the room, and we started with our stories. We went around the room and we each told our story of why immigration was important to us and to our district. And it was deeply moving. I mean, some people told the story of dairies in Kansas or agricultural workers in their district, but other people told the story of just like them and their families and why it was important to them. And so we put together kind of a strategy for how to change some of the rhetoric and the dialogue. And Roger and I just wrote an op-ed together that was published in The Hill, which is a great piece, and I'm really proud of it. And then yesterday, after 2 days of grueling hearings on a horrible ag workers bill that would bring in literally 2 million people who would be working under the minimum wage, would have no housing, no transportation, no rights, would have 10% of their already meager salaries held as bonding until they're done with their 3-year visa, and then they would have to go to a consulate to get that money back. I mean, it's a horrible program. And 2 days of grueling hearings on that. And I come out, and as part of the hearing, I had submitted the op-ed to the Record, and I had read part of it and said this isn't just a Democratic issue, it's a bipartisan issue. And so when I saw that Roger wanted to come and see me, I was like, oh no, he's mad at me for introducing that in what could be seen as a partisan environment, even though it was a public op-ed. He came down, he sat on my couch and said, so what do you think about this farm workers bill? I mean, I'm just so torn and I just need some advice. And I was like, whoa, this is amazing, right? And that's what story does. It builds relationship and allows you to move beyond just a polarized policy position, but to actually appreciate that people are struggling with something. Even if they don't agree with you, they might be struggling, and that struggle is a point of entry for a real conversation.
Thanks. This very much leads into the next one. I think you've already started to answer, but it asks, how do we go beyond the converted? What does it look like to engage people who really do believe what you're saying in terms of like racist comments, bigoted comments, things that are really not what are true to what we want this country to be, or what we want to make this future look like in years to come. So how do we engage those folks, and how do we actually make sure that we're not just talking to the people that agree with us? And is there something that will indicate that change has actually been made, or like how do we know when there is a difference?
Yeah, those are all really good and hard questions. I think that we are so loath to put ourselves in situations where people don't agree with us, and there's good reasons for that. I mean, people struggle with very real challenges in their lives, and to have somebody sort of take that on personally is very difficult. But another part of my story, I went to work for a medical equipment company in Ohio, Western Ohio and Eastern Indiana, because my dad wanted me to be a doctor, a lawyer, or an engineer. Those were like the 3 professions that were acceptable. I am none of those things, but I did try along the way. And I was the first person of color in that district, sales rep in that district. I was the first woman in that district. And I would go into these little fire departments in Indiana, volunteer fire departments, and they'd look at me and say, "Where are you from?" And I'd say, "India." And they'd say, "Where in Indiana?" And I was like, no. different country across the ocean. And we had very little in common politically. I mean, extremely little. But we developed all these relationships, and it was such a great training ground for me because I had to, I was out there on my own. I had to develop relationships, and I really think it's helped me in everything I do. So I would just say that I think it is important to try and put yourselves in those positions, and particularly for those who have more privilege than others, I think it's important because it's difficult for us as folks of color or LGBTQ or folks with disabilities or whatever to always be the ones standing up for the things that we see. We really need our allies, and it has to be done sensitively, but it's really important to not always be the one to take it on. And so that's the first thing, is just to not be afraid to be in those situations. You don't have to be in them 100% of the time, but make it a point to find one time a week or one time a month, if a week sounds too nerve-wracking, once a month, go to a place and actually try, where you think there's not going to be people like you, and try to talk to those folks. I have to do it every day because I'm on Judiciary Committee and I'm in Congress, so I have to do it every single day. So I think that's the first thing. I think the second thing is that we do have an obligation to speak up about what's happening. And the one thing about the place that we're in, I'm always looking for silver linings, because I'm an organizer, and organizers have to be optimists, and you have to be an optimist if you want to be in Congress at this moment. And so, but one silver lining I feel is that this is a time, somebody said to me, this is the era of Trump, and I was like, no, this is the era of the people. And I do think people are awake in a different way, and they're looking at racism, sexism, ableism, ageism, whatever ism is out there, they're looking at it differently. Because it's being put to them by somebody that they really can't tolerate and who's going so far beyond the pale in how, from the highest office in the land. So there's this moment for us to engage with people in a different kind of a way. And I think that, we are at this moral crossroads in the country. So that's an opportunity for us to talk to people who are on a different side. 30% of the people you're never going to get. Don't waste your time with them unless it's because you think, I go on to conservative talk shows because 30% of the people that are on those will never listen to me, but there's probably like 20% of people that listen to those shows that might hear something I have to say. So that's why I go on. But it's worth thinking about the people that you're talking to and trying to find something that connects you and trying to empathize with their position first. That's step number 1. Find something that you truly, don't lie because they'll know, but find something you truly empathize with. And then once you've done that, then tell the truth about how you feel about an issue or correct the record or whatever, and then come back and close with something that brings them back in and connects you again. That's my formula. And if you saw the C-SPAN conversation I had, that's what I did, right? Empathize with him because he feels threatened. People in his family are losing jobs, that guy, the anti-immigrant caller. Then say what's really true, but by the way, Barney, I just don't agree with you that immigrants are to blame, and here's why. But Barney, you and I share so much in common. We both want to fight for people to have opportunity, and I really appreciate your bringing that up.
Thank you. This makes me think about the words that you were saying. I also heard you speak many times about this is not the era of Trump, this is the era of the people, and I just found that to be so powerful at this time. But then also, in addition to that, when you think about people that you know, those that work 9 to 5, those that work evenings, those that work multiple jobs just to make ends meet. Oftentimes we see social justice or advocacy or these words that hold meaning to us that are deeply involved in the work, but for those that are not, you know, often opportunities or capacity are very different. So it could feel very big to imagine that I can only make a difference if I vote, or I can only do something if it is at this level in which folks hold power or this certain positionality. But really, yeah, I just wanted to uplift and really appreciate how you spoke about it's the things, the conversations, the little things that we do that really do make a difference, even at that level.
Yeah, it's such a good point, Stephanie. And I think that, you know, people, I ran into a lot of people about 3 months after the election, after Trump was inaugurated, saying, you know, we've got to get beyond just resistance and being at these town halls, and we're ready to do more. What do we do, and how do we move the conversation beyond this? And what I say to people is, that's where you are, and that's great. We need to have steps, you know, 5, 6, and 7 for you. But there's a lot of people who come to my town halls and we're doing a series called Java with Jayapal, because too many people have never been in a small room like this with a congresswoman. And so I want to say, no, we don't have to have 1,000 people in the room. It can just be 70 of us or 30 of us. And 2/3 of the people that come to those things, right, Hamdi, have never been in a room with a Congress member before. And so that's their first step. That's great. You know, if they need to take that first step before they get to the next step, and the next step, and the next step, that's totally fine. Like, I do not have judgment around what people do or don't do. Well, I might have some judgment. For the people who have been in the movement for a while, I'm like, come on, people, get rid of it. Let's like move. But for people who are new to taking action and to really putting themselves out there, just even showing up at a town hall is a big deal, you know. So we used to have leadership ladders. I'm sure you have that here. But, you know, how do you bring people in? At what step do you bring them in? How do you help support them, train them? And then, you know, we always, because we worked with a lot of young people at One America, Hamdi was one of them. Hamdi Mohammed is
use that ladder.
And now Hamdi's working, Hamdi, by the way, is hands down, and I'm not just saying this because she works with me, but she is hands down the best immigration caseworker on any congressional staff in the state. So, and I'm not kidding about that. We've had hundreds of casework from immigrants, and Hamdi has been just the most powerful advocate and used our office in the way that I want it to be used. So, but you know, we have leadership ladders, right? We don't create leaders. We just create the space that allows leadership to emerge. That is what it means to help develop leadership. It's not like I suddenly say, Brent, you know, I deem you a leader today. You know? That's not how this works. It's like Brent comes, Brent's inspired, and something inside of Brent says, I'm ready to step out and, you know, lead on this in this way, right?
Speaking of leadership development, you know, we are here at 21 Progress, but in relation to that, I know that much of our work with you from the beginning and of our founding was very, and Sharon Mayetta as well, you know, was really rooted in fighting for immigrant rights, doing a lot of work on DACA, and that very much remains true today. But what do you, in terms of immigrant rights and really that path forward, what do you see that's next? Like, what's coming next?
Policy-wise?
Yeah.
Well, let me speak about DACA first. I am encouraged that there was a leak from a Republican meeting just recently that Paul Ryan said that DACA will be part of the budget, the continuing resolution for the government to continue to operate, which will come up at the first week of December, because they don't have the votes to get that resolution through without us, without Democrats. So we have leverage, and what we need to keep doing is pushing, as activists have been doing, pushing for a Clean Dream Act, and pushing to make sure that that is, that we continue to work towards that. Now, that said, we should not settle for December. I mean, unfortunately, some folks are now turning their attention to December, but we have a discharge petition that has every Democrat in the House is signed on to the discharge petition. A discharge petition means if you get 218 signatures on that petition, then that piece of legislation must come to the floor. The Speaker of the majority party can't keep it from coming to the floor. So if we can get this discharge petition to have just 25 more signatures, then we can actually bring the DREAM Act to the floor for a vote. So that needs to be our focus right now, is still getting Republicans to sign the discharge petition and get it to the floor. If we are not able to do that, because it's tough, it basically means Republicans are giving a root sign to their leadership by signing a discharge petition, right, and saying, yeah, we want to bring this to the floor in opposition to your leadership. Then our next place of leverage is the continuing resolution, and really insisting that DACA and a solution for the Dreamers has to be in that continuing resolution. Steve Miller, who is, I've called for him to be I've called for 3 people to be fired for white supremacy. Two are gone. One is still there. So we are, that's not me, that's the movement. But we are, this guy is horrendous, and he is the one who influenced, he's influenced Trump to put out these immigration principles that are just awful. And in exchange for DACA and for allowing young folks to stay here, by the way, with no path to citizenship according to their plan, he wants to reform the legal immigration system, completely cut back on that, have a even bigger mass deportation force, put more people into detention, more ICE enforcement, sanctuary cities punishment. I mean, you name it, it's all in those immigration principles. And so it's totally separate from what the Senate agreed to in a bipartisan way in 2013 with 68 bipartisan votes for a comprehensive immigration reform bill. So that's what we're dealing with. In judiciary, we're dealing with every single day, practically, every single hearing, at least I should say, to be more accurate. Almost every single one is an anti-immigrant bill. And so we have passed all kinds of just horrendous things that further criminalize immigrants, and this ag workers bill that I was telling you about, it's just nonstop. And so that is their, immigrants are the whipping boy, and many other communities are too, but certainly this one seems to be a clear place to try to play to the base, throw red meat to the base, and just continue to polarize.
Just want to honor folks' time. We know that it is 8:30, but we have one last question that we're hoping to answer, not answer, but just really ask. If you would be comfortable sharing, a lot of stuff that we do here at 21 Progress is about sharing stories, but not only sharing stories as part of movement building, but as this way that we show one another and exchange authenticity, that we get to talk about justice and equity. And what Mozart always likes to bring back to our team is this concept of joy and justice, and that you can't have one without the other. So outside of being Congresswoman, outside of caring deeply about justice and doing these things that many people do know here in this room, what are those things that do bring you joy and that are most important to you outside of all of that?
It's actually pretty easy, because this has been a really tough week. I don't know if people saw my questioning of Scott Lloyd on the Jane Doe abortion case, and then we had these 2 days of hearings, and so I was like, my husband texted me last night, said, I'm going to pick you up from the airport, are you hungry? And I said, hungry for love. And I texted him back, and I said, hungry for love. And so I come out, and he's there, and I have a beautiful Labradoodle, 65-pound Labradoodle named Otis. And Otis is in the car, he loves to stick his head out the window, and he's looking everywhere, and I can see him because he can't see me and I'm over here. And he's looking everywhere, and he's yelping, and he does this every time he comes to pick me up. He's yelping, and then he sees me, and he just starts going crazy in the car. His tail is, because he's huge, and his tail is wagging, and I go up to him, and he licks my face all over. Really lovely dog slobber. And and we're all just laughing. Steve gets out of the car and hugs me and kisses me, and I'm like, okay. And then this morning we're in the car coming here, and my son called me, my 20-year-old son from India. He's studying abroad there, and we start speaking Hindi, because in 6 weeks he's become incredibly conversant in Hindi. And I just realized that, you know, that deep sense of support and love from my dog, from my son, from my husband, from my, you know, from people who, on the airplane, there were 5 flight attendants who pulled me into the back. You know, they like refused to accept money when I try to buy my fruit and cheese platter. They're like, no way, you're not paying. And I'm like, please, please take, you know, no. But they pull me into the back and they start having this deep conversation about how can this be, you know, how can this be that we're in this position? And thank you. And they just kept taking my arm and saying, don't ever stop fighting, don't ever stop fighting. And so that sense of us all being in this together and being supported and being loved in that deep way is really what keeps me going. And I really believe that I talk about love all the time in my speeches. I don't believe that you can achieve anything if you don't feel loved and if you don't exhibit love. I just don't think it's possible. It is the great driving force.
And so, Rise #1 is done. As you were speaking, I was just thinking about so many quotes I love. And so, Cornel Wells, from King, he says, justice is what love looks like in public, right? And so, so I wanted to share that one because I think that's always a really good one. And I was looking up Paul Loeb, who's a local person, and he also says possibility is the oxygen upon which hope thrives. And I think that a lot of the things that you shared really create that sense of possibility, that sense of hope. Here at 21 Progress, we do 3 things. We prepare leaders, we empower communities, and we mobilize folks for civic action. The way we prepare leaders is through intensive developmental programs that don't just focus on results, skills, how to be the best organizer, but how do we have relationships that build a movement, right? Where people who love justice and want gender equity are also talking to people who are anti-racist. People who are anti-racist are talking to people who care about queer rights, who care about Muslim folks, who care about undocumented folks. And by bringing these people together and making sure that they bring rigor, they bring analysis, they bring a sense of history, that we might have a generation, which is the largest generation ever of young folks, that could change history, right? The second thing we do is empower communities. Unfortunately, there aren't a lot of people who have access to resources and services. And so even the work Hamdi does at the Congressional Office, how do we make sure more and more people know that that information is available and that folks know their rights? Today, we have many students who have been marginalized, who unfortunately in schools are oftentimes taken advantage of. And so we go into those settings and with our amazing staff, make sure that folks know their rights, both at school and at work. And then the third one is mobilizing for civic action. And so when Daniel Ramirez, who was arrested for sounding and looking like an immigrant in February of 2017, young folks, undocumented folks who had been arrested in other states, decided to put their bodies on the line and speak on the steps of a federal courthouse and say, not here, not now, and we're willing to risk our voices, including a mother who drove all the way from Tacoma to be in front of a federal courthouse at 9 in the morning, to share their stories. And so you can find out a little bit more about our work right there. Ways you can get involved, of course, we have many because we're a nonprofit. So the first one is that if folks give today at $15,